Okay, we're recording. All right, well, welcome everyone to NC State's Oceans of Opportunity webinar. I'm Chris Osborne. I'm director of the NC State Blue Economy Innovation Program, and I'll be today's moderator. This webinar was conceived by my co-host, Ms. Ashita Pairakar, an undergraduate major in computer engineering at NC State and a Grand Challenges Scholar. We produced this in collaboration with NC State's Coastal Resilience and Sustainability Initiative, the NC State Social Innovation Fellows, and the Grand Challenge Scholars Program Network. So the objective of the series is to provide an overview of the blue economy's role in fostering sustainable economic growth, its global and social impacts, and relevance across various industries. So for the purposes of our discussion, we are defining the blue economy as the sustainable use of the ocean and its connected coastal domains for the benefit of all. And these webinars will consist of guided questions posed by me to our panelists, but please feel free to post your own questions using the Zoom Q&A feature. And once we conclude our main discussion, we'll turn our attention to the questions you pose. So one of the things we want to do with this webinar series and how to establish a sustainable blue economy is ensuring it's equitable and inclusive for those economic opportunities. And to start our first webinar, we're going to focus on a discussion of building and sustaining blue economies in two comparable coastal regions, North Carolina and Louisiana. Before I introduce our panel guests, wanted to take a look at the poll results, and it looks like we've got about 30% graduate students, 30% entrepreneurs, and about 15 or so percent folks from nonprofit or government, industry, and academia. So good mix there. And I'm pleased to introduce our panelists for today. First of all, Dr. Jane Harrison is a coastal economist at North Carolina Sea Grant, who applies economic analysis and other social science methods to meet the needs of coastal stakeholders. She regularly collaborates with city planners and elected officials, private businesses, and residents to safeguard natural resources and to make smart long-term investments in infrastructure. Dr. Harrison has led development of the NC Oyster Trail, which I hope we'll hear more about today, a unique tourism experience. And she's also a graduate faculty member in the College of Natural Resources and in Agricultural and Resources Economics Department at NC State University, where she teaches economic development and looking at the development and challenges and strategies being pursued in rural and urban areas of North Carolina. Also with us today is Mr. Greg DeLon. He's managing director and co-founder of the Deep Blue Institute and founder and executive director of the nonprofit Deep Blue Academy, where he's creator and host of the Blue Economy Primer podcast. He's a board member for the New Orleans-based data center and CEO and co-founder of the Urban Innovation Exchange. He's an internationally recognized consultant, teacher, and speaker and writer with over 20 years of experience, specializing in sustainable economic development and public-private partnerships for green cities and smart cities, regenerative floating cities, and sustainable economic development and innovation system design. He's an architect and a licensed landscape architect, an urban planner, and a development specialist. He's worked on clean tech and with entrepreneurs and incubators and accelerators, and holds a master's of city planning and professional master's of landscape architecture from UC Berkeley. So we've got a number of questions we'll get to now. And the first question I want to pose to Jane Harrison. So Jane, you've reported on the blue economy in North Carolina, and you discussed in this concept of different types of capitals. So could you tell us how different capitals manifest in North Carolina's blue economy?
Yeah, happy to, Chris. And I do have a few slides if you want to bring those up. I want to first really define what I mean by the blue economy, because folks do use slightly different definitions. And so this is the way I define things. If you want to, yeah, great, looks good. I see it as a sustainable ocean and coastal economy, which emerges when economic activity is in balance with the long-term capacity of ocean and coastal ecosystems. So the idea is that, economic activity should not take away from the natural resources that, allow us to live on this earth, but rather that we need, economic activity and, jobs that reinvest in the critical coastal environment. So the next slide has a diagram of community capitals. So these are different kinds of capitals that I'm always thinking about really when I want to get anything done, but certainly to move towards a blue economy. These are some of the pieces, financial capital. That's probably what we often think about first when you hear the word capital. So certainly we're going to need access to money, income, could be credit, loans to, start new businesses, entrepreneurial activities, even to invest in restoring our ecosystems or trying to repair damages that have been done to our environment. That all has a cost. So, for example, I'm really excited about the Inflation Reduction Act at the federal level that started a few years ago, and that provides a lot of, subsidies and discounts to do, climate reduction economic activities, whether that's, building electric cars or putting solar panels on homes. All of a sudden, folks have a little bit more financial space to make those investments, and that's critical. Built capital is really, our built environment. So roads, schools, buildings, those are our homes. Is our infrastructure, up to the task of having a dynamic, economy? And in our coastal areas of North Carolina, we have a lot of stresses on that built capital, when there's a hurricane, when a storm is approaching, as one is right now, we have folks that are getting prepared for that. They have to be ready. They're going to need, a strong roof. We're going to have to probably rebuild roads that get washed over. And so those are continual pieces that we've got to invest back into to make our coastal environment, which, is subject to some extreme weather, viable. Now, I would also like to speak to human capital. Human capital, that's about us as people. What skills do we have? What knowledge? How's our health? So how can we contribute to the workforce to make the blue economy possible? Natural capital, I think you all can guess what that is, but those are our environmental resources. So is our coastal and marine environment in good shape? I'm going to talk a lot about, or a little bit about oysters today. And I see, oysters for North Carolina as, really a canary in the coal mine. So if they are doing well, we know a lot of our coastal marine ecosystem is doing well. And, we want our, water quality to be high so that whatever we're drinking out of the faucet, we can trust. We want to be able to go to the beach, to go swimming. We have a very robust tourism economy in our coastal communities in North Carolina. If you can't go to the beach and, go there safely and know that it's safe to get in the water, that would have a huge economic impact. Now, political capital, that's where it's very important for us to also have representation, both at the local, state and federal levels that, is going to reinvest back into our communities. Cultural capital, that's how we do things. Those are our traditions, our language, the types of food that we eat, our traditional livelihoods. So we have a huge fishing, economy still in North Carolina. We have some of the most diverse fisheries on the eastern coast because we sit there, at Cape Hatteras, we are actually at the edge of, where the Labrador Current from the north hits the Gulf Stream. So we have this huge diversity of fisheries. That means a lot of different kinds of seafood. And that's something that we want to continue to invest back in. And finally, social capital. Social capital, those are our relationships. That's how we connect to one another. Sometimes, I often see folks knowing how to build bonding social capital. So bonding social capital are those relationships among people that are very similar to one another, similar, socioeconomic, backgrounds. But what I always want us to think about is bridging social capital in a community. So how do we connect to those that maybe are different from us, maybe grew up somewhere different, maybe have different political beliefs than us? Because if we can work across those lines, then I think we can do a lot together.
Okay, thank you. Greg, I wanted to follow up with you and see if you could share about Louisiana and what some parallels might be between the capitals that Jane talked about in North Carolina and Louisiana.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Ishita, if you could pull up the ecosystem diagram, I think that'd probably be a good place to start. And I would just start by, first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm particularly excited that folks have had a chance, some of you had a chance to listen to the Blue Economy Primer. Great to see the mix in terms of a mix of different sectors. So a lot of my work and where I come from as an urban planner, an architect, landscape architect, or an economic development specialist is looking at public-private partnerships. So how can this mix of sectors that we have here on the seminar today work together in the private sector, in the public sector, and in research, et cetera, to build sustainable economies? With regard to the blue economy, real quickly, and the definition, I really appreciate Jane's definition there. And I think one thing that we have in common, again, as well as what you said, Chris, is we all seem to be defining our definition of blue economy and blue technologies for Deep Blue Institute has that sustainability component. So blue economy in the broader sense can include, shipping and building ports and fossil fuel use and marine environment. So I think it's really relevant that we're all including this idea of sustainability and thinking about oceans and coastal areas, including ideas of being equitable and inclusive, and all that, because otherwise, if we're just talking about economic development, I think the big risk or business as usual is that we're basically going to take our bad habits that we've developed through the Industrial Revolution and through to the present with the environmental crisis, with the climate crisis, and essentially transfer those into the marine environment, contributing to the destruction of the marine environment and our coastal areas. So in our approach, and certainly I think dovetailing with a slightly different viewpoint with the idea of the community capitals that Jane's talking about, is this eco-solution space or ecosystem approach to how we look at the different components of the blue economy. So looking at this diagram, we use this a lot to explain our approach at Deep Blue Institute and Deep Blue Academy in the different sectors. So starting no particular place, we can start anywhere, but let's start with educate. So that would be our the research sector, including K through 12, the community education, workforce development, undergraduate and graduate degrees, and what is all the research and knowledge that's going into these different activities in the coastal areas. And then from there, moving counterclockwise, the ideate is really sort of the core activity that Deep Blue Institute started with, is sort of a think tank of ideas, ideation, innovation. So kind of the innovation component of this. And then continuing with insights, moving to the left into the incubate and onto the invest area. This is where we get into emerging technologies and exciting ideas that may be coming from that education or research area, but then through the entrepreneurial activity of professors or graduate students or or professionals, that we're starting to develop new technologies and concepts and solution sets that then translate in that invest area into startups. So you'll see the darker blue is the for-profit component of this flywheel or ecosystem diagram. And that's where the opportunity for these emerging technologies come into play, that then they start through innovative projects, start to get incorporated into the consulting and the operations of the projects that are happening in the field. So I think that's where we really get into some of these community capitals out in the field, in our case in Louisiana, in the Bayou regions and the different communities, that we have an incredible biodiversity. Louisiana is actually the sportsman's paradise is our motto. So all kinds of fishing and hunting, but also in terms of culture, food, music, history, etc., in New Orleans, but also beyond into the community. So that's where we can hopefully start to bring all these new ideas and innovations into the communities and actually build the economy, build the for-profit economy. And then all that, to complete the circle, comes back to supporting our local universities and strong education systems that are raising the next generation of people that are seeing opportunities and developing new ideas of how Louisiana, how the Gulf Coast can deal with our own problems and save our communities, but then also how does that translate into exportable workforce development and solution sets and emerging technologies that can help the other communities around the world that will be facing these similar existential threats in the coming decades as we navigate the climate crisis. And then in the middle there, we see the different types of funding. So that would be diversified funding, that in some cases would be for-profit funding in the form of these innovative companies, but then also in some cases that funding or other nonprofit funding that's supporting the research, education, et cetera. So there's a lot of specific activities already going on in Louisiana. In the case of education, we're working with the University of New Orleans and the Beach Research Institution there, but then also starting to work with Tulane and LSU. And then in each of these sectors, we're already doing some kind of activities, whether it be the podcast activities or monthly events or working with local projects or even developing new technologies in the form of solar energy projects or agricultural waste projects. So the idea is that this is not just an interlocking ecosystem, but it also becomes a bit of a flywheel where things support each other and all of these sectors grow to create a thriving blue economy that, in terms of the narrative we're trying to build, that New Orleans and the southeast area of Louisiana is a leader in this and therefore can start to supply and deliver solutions for other parts of the country and other parts of the world.
Great. Thank you, Greg. So this is a great discussion, and I was very keen to hear both of you speak to some of the more kind of community and social capitals and that sense of and cultural and that sense of culture. I think there's a lot of parallels between North Carolina and Louisiana that perhaps we can get into a little bit. But Jane, one thing in your description of all of these different capitals, do you have a sense for which ones are which capitals are chronically the ones that are maybe most stressed or the ones that are always or in most need of development?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. But you really need all of them, that's for sure. And every community is going to have a different mix, so it's going to depend on your area. I think in some of our more rural areas that don't have as much just general economic activity, they are going to struggle to keep their built infrastructure up. So, reinvesting in schools, not having a big enough maybe tax base to, continue to make investments, that can be really tough. But certainly, the natural capital piece, we have non-renewable resources and we have renewable ones. But in both cases, we have to be somewhat thoughtful. And I always think about just being a little bit conservative about our use of those resources because they don't necessarily last forever. And so I'll just give one example about, water quality. There are tipping points where if we have certain land use decisions, if we have a certain amount of development, impervious surface, runoff with pollution after storm events, you can't, for example, then harvest oysters. We have this huge success story going on with oysters in the state, but after a rain event, for a few days, sometimes a week, we can't do any harvest because there is pollution out there in that environment. So if we are not cognizant of all of the other, activities that we have going on, then we're not going to have local seafood, and we're going to have to choose other protein sources. And, unfortunately, a lot of our major protein sources, are going to be, land animals that are farmed. And we do a lot of that in this state, hog farming, for example, poultry, and those also have some real negative environmental impacts. So how are we choosing, kind of our consumption choices that are going to maintain the quality of life and the environment that is what we expect?
Thanks, Jane. Greg, to you to kind of follow up on that point, does Louisiana face similar types of challenges with developing different types of capitals? And do you see any specifically that are that need innovation, need help and development?
Yeah, a couple of things come to mind. I mean, first of all, there's the physical reality of land loss. Actually, Ashita, if you could pull up the map of Louisiana that I included. So in Louisiana, the land loss that we're facing is pretty extraordinary. The studies show that we're losing about a football field of land every 90 minutes. So that in the case of Plaquemines Parish, which is the last parish that is actually the mouth of the Mississippi, Plaquemines has actually lost 50% of its land mass in the previous decades. So in terms of the loss of physical capital of land and what that means for coastal communities, that is an incredible issue that we're facing. And that obviously also we get into saltwater infiltration, we get into storm damage, loss of buildings, loss of the dislocation of communities. So there's a lot of stress on communities at a cultural level, as a physical level, et cetera, that we're facing. Of course, when we're talking about the blue economy and we're talking about these opportunities and challenges that we're facing, none of this is happening in a vacuum in terms of all the other things that are happening in various economies or parts of the countries or parts of the world. So in the Southeast United States, and particularly in Louisiana, we are facing racial issues and economic issues. So as it relates to, so that's just the map showing the land loss that we're facing, that we have been facing, and that we're potentially facing in the future. So these are real places where real people live, and there's a lot of implications about dislocation and relocation of people or migrations inland. But getting back to some of the racial and wealth issues, part of the work that I do with the data center is a well-established data interpretation and publishing organization in New Orleans. On our board meeting today, we were actually talking about the racial wealth gap, and that is improving slightly in Louisiana and New Orleans, but is a huge issue, and really underscores a lack of equity and a lack of opportunity. So I think the big thing that we can work on and hope for with the blue economy and with the growth and diversification of sectors, in the case of Louisiana, away from fossil fuels and away from tourism and into potentially emerging technologies, emerging ways of coping with land loss and climate change, and new sustainable industries that may have to do with sustainable harvesting from the ocean, potentially things that are going to help with algae blooms and the seaweed islands and mats that we have coming in across the Atlantic. that if we can create these sustainable new opportunities and technologies, that's where we can start to deal with some of these unique issues that are continuing, and thanks to things like the pandemic, et cetera, in some cases got worse, but can be improved if we're looking at the blue economy in this sort of long-term opportunity way.
Great, thank you. And that might be a good opportunity to move into this concept of maritime urbanism. Could you explain that for us, Greg, and give us some examples of how that plays out in Louisiana?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Ishita, if you could pull up that Nouveau-Né Parish slide that talks to that a little bit. So, maritime urbanism is actually a term that I believe was coined, but is used a lot by a Dutch engineer that we interviewed for one of the Blue Economy Primer podcasts. That's part of a company in Rotterdam called Blue 21. So that's a Dutch company, and the Dutch in general are doing a lot of work with floating communities and engineering and architectural solutions to land loss, or to looking for new ways of creating opportunities for people to live on and near the water. So one of the ways that we're looking at this in Louisiana is so maritime urbanism, as you can imagine, is fundamentally it's thinking about cities, thinking about urbanism in an aquatic environment, and what are the opportunities that come with that. So Buckminster Fuller talked about how pollution is nothing but the resources we are not harvesting. We allow them to disperse because we've been ignorant of their values. So part of this work that came out of the Seasteading Institute and with Blue 21 was this idea that you have infrastructure on land that may be waste treatment, maybe water treatment, maybe irrigation, and you have pollution in the form of urban runoff and agricultural runoff that's getting into our rivers and streams and ending up on our coast. So with the idea of floating cities or maritime urbanism, it essentially starts to talk about the idea of how can floating communities and these sorts of maritime engineering, blue economy, blue technologies, ocean technologies like mariculture, hydroponics, pollution farming, and habitat restoration in aquatic environments, how can those actually benefit from these nutrient-rich runoffs from urban areas, and then provide, by harvesting those, to provide those back to land-based or other communities in the form of good food, clean water, and biofuels and other sorts of things. So these are all technologies that fundamentally exist, but the challenge is how do we start to take the existing models that, again, are already being developed by the Dutch. There's also interesting work going on in Miami. They have a concept called salty urbanism, which seeks to deal with areas that will not be protected when the waters rise in Miami, and neighborhoods end up under 8 to 10 feet of water, and people have to move to the second level. What are the different technologies and ways that we can think about urbanism and architectural design and engineering in a way that actually is benefiting and capitalizing on what till now we've seen as fundamentally problems of pollution, et cetera. So that's a general view. There's a lot more we can get into in terms of what are the different elements and technologies that are part of this new way of looking at marine environments and urban environments, and how they might combine in the form of floating or submerged cities.
Thanks, Greg. Jane, going back to you now, I was curious if you're aware of any similar types of projects or initiatives related to the maritime urbanism in North Carolina.
Yeah, I don't know of any floating city concepts that we have. We certainly have the, floating oyster farms and mariculture. If you want, you can bring up the slide and I can show you what one of our farms looks like. It's not, I'd say, too high tech, but I think that's okay. Sometimes what works is just can be basic too. So I think there's room for like really new technologies, and then there's also just room for using what's tried and true. And I think especially for folks who are in the seafood business or come from a commercial fishing background, they want to know that this is worked for their industry. So anyway, with oysters, we've been doing a few things here. We have been restoring oyster reefs. So those are typically going to be, in the estuarine environment, but also a little bit out. We've restored about 500 acres in the last 20 years. And that's not just to produce more wild oysters, it's also to create habitat for other spawning finfish and crustaceans. So there's about 300 species that actually rely on oyster reefs for their homes. And then certainly beyond humans, there's a lot of creatures that also eat oysters. Oysters are also helping to stabilize our shorelines. So you can see here the kind of oyster beds that are in front of the grass, and that's going to help keep that landmass in place. I think one of the challenges in our coastal environment is because of the movement of land, which Greg spoke about, land loss. We're trying to do as much as we can to shore up our barrier islands in a way that, again, plays well with the ecosystem and doesn't damage, ecosystem function. So oysters have a big role to play there. And then I think on the next slide, you'll see the just the growth around farming oysters. Again, this particular way of growing oysters, it helps to reduce pressure on wild stocks. We've had an exponential increase in farming since about 2015 or 16. And I know this slide only goes to 2021, but those numbers continue to rise. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see a picture of what oyster farming looks like. Again, they're just basic cages. It's kind of like carrying rocks around. That's what the oyster farmers tell me. As the oysters grow, they're put as little baby seeds spat in these cages that are floating. And then they are graded. So over time, checked for their size, and then when they're of appropriate harvest size, then they're going to come to our plate. And I always remind folks that you can actually eat oysters, now every day with a Y. So that is every day. It's not just the R months anymore. So when we were only harvesting wild oysters, typically that season in North Carolina starts October 15th and ends by April. So September through April, and now we can actually eat farmed oysters all year round, which is quite exciting.
So I was wondering, could you pick up on that thought about the noble oyster and tell us a little bit about the NC Oyster Trail as a success story?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I would invite everyone to check out our website, ncoystertrail.org, or follow us on Instagram, NC_oyster trail. We have an interactive map on our website that shows about 100 different places you can visit in the state. Whether that's to eat oysters, from North Carolina, at a seafood restaurant, pick them up at a market. If you want to volunteer and help create these living shorelines, created with oysters, we have events like that. We put on North Carolina Oyster Month, which is October, so it's coming up. It's next week. Check out our events. It's going to be so much fun. There are oyster roasts, there's oyster concerts. Part of what we're doing is we're trying to increase the supply of oysters, but we also want to maintain, again, cultural traditions. Oyster roasts are, part of the history of living on the coast in this area. And we want to ensure that folks, can continue to, have this protein source.
Right, thank you. Greg, this brings up an interesting point about economic opportunities and creating these sustainable economies, both sustainable for the natural environment as well as the economic sustainability. I was wondering if you could maybe tell us about the desire to create these sustainable economies. How does that best, in your experience, manifest in business development?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And maybe I'll start with just in building on this topic of oysters. So, as many of you on the call probably know, and I'm sure Dr. Harrison as well, my understanding is that oysters can filter up to 50 gallons of water per day per oyster. So the I mentioned that because of the mix of benefits. So similar to many of the programs that you all are working on in North Carolina, with our tourism industry here, we go through a lot of oysters with folks coming here and wanting to eat oysters, and we eat a lot ourselves. So there's a lot of programs now, I'm sure, like you have there, where basically the oyster shells are reclaimed at the restaurants. They're bagged and brought back to the habitat, and they're used either specifically in areas where oyster farming is going on, or else sacks of oysters are essentially used as a protection or to build bulwarks of areas that then can become areas for land reclamation. So I think in terms of that specific example, and we could probably come up with a couple other benefit streams that are coming from these mix of activities. But to me, it's about multiple benefit streams that come from these activities along the coast, that something like an oyster or a wetland or even municipal wastewater can actually be filtered and used in its after a primary treatment and what is it? Is it infrared? I forget what kind of light you use, but basically, after an initial treatment, we can use municipal wastewater to irrigate with nutrient-rich water wetlands that then are growing biomass, growing land. And you can imagine with your bags of oysters and a wetland, and now you're growing biomass. And depending on who you talk to, that biomass in a marine environment compared to an upland environment is growing at between 10x and even 80x. So the 80x number blew me away, but that's actually from the director of the Water Institute in Louisiana, Bo Jones. So these are ways that we can work with, again, things that are pollution or byproducts, and turn them into solution sets that are actually creating a land in areas where we're losing land. And all of these are with them creating job opportunities, whether it's working in these wastewater assimilation plants, or working in the oyster industry, or working in an evolving fishing industry. We also, with our river diversions in the Mississippi, which are very controversial but very important, we're changing, habitats are changing from what used to be a saltwater environment is now changing to a brackish environment, or certainly a more of a freshwater environment. So that's changing the nature of tourism for fishing. It's changing the nature of multi-generational fishermen and aquaculture, mariculture. So there's a lot of things that are creating economic opportunities, but they require the type of innovation and support, and again, the public-private partnerships where we're creating education and training and support and all this, so that we can not only be saving these communities that are at physical risk from land loss and storms, et cetera, but that there are long-term opportunities that are coming, and we're dynamically preparing for what the coming decades will look like. Again, not just for the North American coast, the Southeast coast, but areas around the world that will be in desperate need of these, frankly, very lucrative and important solution sets.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. And Jane, I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on how we continue to strengthen these opportunities, and what beyond the oysters and water quality, what are some other things in North Carolina you see where we can make progress?
Oh yeah. Yeah, if you want to bring back my slides, I've got a couple examples. And I think the first one is actually about some of our constraints, but I always think of, what's the opposite of a constraint? It's really, what's the opportunity in this? So if we have a gap, then how do we fill it? So, these are some of the issues that we're dealing with: habitat loss, development, land use trends. Just look at the cost of living. How much housing do we have in our coastal areas? It's becoming much more expensive to live in these communities. So your workforce all of a sudden has to travel, an hour there and back to get to work in the tourism industry. That's going to affect the tourists. That's going to affect the folks that can afford to live in these communities. We do have water quality impairments. We have, as Greg mentioned, issues of inequality, whether that's due to, historic discrimination, lack of ability to have generational wealth transfer. Those are all things that really affect people's, opportunities. If you want to start your own business, you're probably going to have to pay for your own health insurance. And that's expensive in this country. So we don't always, I'd say, put together the right special sauce to allow people to innovate as they might want to. And then certainly human health and education is critical. We see a lot of sometimes brain drain, young people leaving rural areas, maybe not staying in coastal communities if the type of work they want are in bigger cities. And so that's something we have to deal with, certainly in North Carolina, where we don't have a lot of big cities on the coast. But again, opportunities, what can we do? The next slide is something that we've been, kind of brewing on, working towards for many years, and that's offshore wind. So there's a lot of opportunity in North Carolina for alternative energies, whether that's solar and wind farms, again, on land, or, these wind farms offshore. I will say that the regulatory environment on this makes it a very tough business to get going. Lots and lots of rules and regulations, very important ones, but again, difficult to get it going. We haven't seen a single wind farm yet in North Carolina. And then also the financial environment right now with high interest rates. These are expensive efforts to install. A lot of the equipment is built in Europe. It has to then come to Norfolk as our biggest, large port in Virginia, and then come down to North Carolina. So I think our, interest rate environment has to shift for this to be a real opportunity, coming up, but it will come. The next slide, I have a picture just to kind of indicate, how do we get around in our communities? So I want us to think about green transit. So this type of infrastructure to ensure that, again, we are taking care of our coastal and marine environment. So do we have to get around by car, or are there opportunities, to improve pedestrian safety, bicycle networks? Do we have public transit? I see a lot of that missing in coastal North Carolina, and that means we're going to continue to have more traffic, just headaches. It's taking longer and longer for people to get to where they need to go. I see that in Raleigh also, where I live. Commute times from people's work to the home are growing. And that's an issue. So I really advocate for every community to build up different ways of getting around. We have to move beyond the car. And then finally, one more opportunity that I'd be remiss if I didn't mention is in the political sphere. So I recommend that everyone think about, your local decision makers, so local government. Political organizing is a blue economy opportunity. If you want to see things change in your coastal community or where you live, figure out who's in charge. That's the town government or the city government. That could be the county. Sometimes it's, a watershed, like a regional watershed group that is providing recommendations for how to manage water resources. So figure out how you can get involved. I decided to run for office in 2022. I was elected to Raleigh City Council, and now I have, this amazing opportunity to shape the capital city of North Carolina, our environmental agenda, our policies around how do we reduce flooding downstream, when there's a storm event, how do we protect our drinking water supply. So not everyone needs to run for office, but see how you can get involved where you live. There are a lot of opportunities there.
Thanks, Jane. Greg, I was wondering if you could tell us about maybe your experiences in different ways of changing people's attitudes or opinions in business development. Have you found more success kind of at that local scale, or does it can you aim high?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think building on the idea of politics right now, we all know how divisive some of this can be, and even the idea of whether climate change is real or any of that sort of a thing. So I've worked with various organizations, including the Clean Tech Open, which is an incubator accelerator focused on clean and green technologies. And I was in the Bay Area, so I was working in Silicon Valley and the San Francisco Bay Area for about 20 years, and there's a lot of alignment there on these sorts of discussions and approaches to emerging technologies and all that, and what we can do about it in terms of environment and policy. So moving to Louisiana, and when I'm engaging with various folks in the private sector, particularly investors and policymakers, et cetera, the thing that I've found being back in Louisiana is I don't need to necessarily use language that for some people they may find challenging or antagonizing in terms of who caused the climate crisis or what's going on with it in terms of political policies. But fundamentally, so to speak, the common language is the green language. And then when I say green, I mean money. So what are the economic opportunities? It's where the blue economy really comes into play. Fundamentally, these are economic opportunities. So I mentioned about Plaquemine Parish losing 50% of its landmass. Well, our lieutenant governor is from Plaquemine's Parish. So these are realities that people are facing. The damage from storms, the millions or billions of dollars of that are resulting from that. The opportunity to build, there's a program called Fortified Homes, Fortified Roofing. So these are new building programs, new roof technologies, new building structure and engineering technologies. All this is impacting the insurance industry. I'm sure we all know about the insurance industry pulling out of parts of Louisiana, pulling out of Florida because of increased storm activity and the inability to cover those at an underwriting level. So I think a lot of what we talk about in the language we use can be in the form of economic opportunity, business opportunity. And with that, I would just underscore the opportunity with entrepreneurship in general. So I understand North Carolina State has some entrepreneur activities. There's a lot of entrepreneurship in the ecosystem growing here around that. So that's what Deep Blue Institute, we talk about the blue economy and blue tech. So what are all these? And we talk about the blue tech delta, the Mississippi blue tech delta, that whether it's offshore wind, which is also very, very hot topic here, and we're developing policies and technologies in Louisiana, but direct air capture, carbon sequestration, two major projects going on in Louisiana, a very red state, but we've got a Republican governor who is coming out in 100% support of direct air capture of carbon and carbon sequestration. And the state is realizing, with G&O Inc. as our regional economic development group in New Orleans, and LED as our Louisiana state level, realizing the opportunities from carbon sequestration and offshore wind and these other things. So lots of opportunity to frame all of this as economic opportunities that really cross political boundaries and ideologies.
Great, thank you for that. This is a great transition to a question that's been posed here, and I'll read out the question and then give you each an opportunity to respond. So the question is, for those graduate students who are looking to start a career in the blue economy, what advice would you give them for their years in school and job opportunities once they've graduated? Jane, we can start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I always think when you're starting out, really hone your technical skills. get, I'd say go as far deep as you can in whatever, your particular discipline is. You're going to have a lot of opportunities to work across disciplines as your career moves along. But if you can, establish yourself as, competent, expert in your field, you're always going to be needed. And so I do a lot of interdisciplinary work. I started out, in my career as an economist, and a lot of my work nowadays is bringing together teams to deal with thorny economic issues. But I'm not even necessarily the one doing, the hardcore economics research anymore. I'm the one, kind of compiling all the pieces, synthesizing the work, making sure it gets to our target audiences, that it can inform policy. But if I didn't have my early days of, writing research publications and doing, detailed economic data analysis, then I wouldn't have had that kind of opportunity to get where I am today. So I know it can be a little bit, I don't know, tedious at times when you're only in one space or you're only focused on one thing. And now in our world of fractured minds at all times, I get on my phone to do one thing and then I somehow have done 7 things, forgot the one thing I was going to do. I just, really recommend any way that you can keep your attention narrow and focused and put kind of those guardrails around your work so that you have undivided attention and time, you will, see a lot come from that.
Greg?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and frankly, a lot of it depends on sort of your individual sort of nature, where you're more inclined to go. I am a big advocate for entrepreneurship, as I said, these emerging technologies. So depending on what you're doing and what you're studying, there could be an opportunity to team with a professor, to team with fellow students, to take advantage of an entrepreneurship program and really hit the ground with some promising technology, mariculture, aquaculture. It could be, I work with companies that do like drone technology for collecting data on coastal areas. So I think there's a lot of opportunities in the blue economy in which you can be doing. My personal path was working as an architect for 3 or 4 years and then getting a couple graduate degrees that then sort of narrowed in on what I was interested in terms of sustainable urban development, economic development. So I think there's a lot to be said for getting practical experience out of the gate with an organization, understanding how organizations and management and project management and all that works before you go do further academic work and do your graduate work perhaps. But I think things are very dynamic right now. One of my favorite authors around this is somebody named Alex Steffens, and I can share the link to some of his work with Chris. But Alex talks about the disruption that's going on with the climate crisis and the idea that the experts that are out there right now fundamentally are not prepared, even though they're the top world experts in whatever field, they're not even qualified to deal with the problems and issues that are coming up. And we need to rethink the way we're educating so that we're creating or producing a next generation of problem solvers that are dynamic problem solvers that are evolving at the same speed that these problems are evolving, because that's the world we're going to be looking at. We start hitting some of these tipping points about ocean temperature and currents and atmospheric currents, et cetera. We need a next generation that is a very dynamic problem solver. So I think that a mix of disciplines and the ability to work across disciplines with other professionals and other experts is going to be really critical. And whether you're doing that as an entrepreneur or in an organization or whatever you're doing, I think those are some of the guideposts in terms of how can we be most effective and successful in our own careers and in our contributions to what's going to be happening in the coming decades.
And if I can add to that, I think, it's really having an adaptation mindset, just being ready to move with the changes, because change is happening all the time. It's happening at a faster and faster rate. So whatever is, your discipline or your skill set, be aware of how it intersects with, other industries that maybe you're not, partial to yet. But, set up interviews, with, I kind of think of folks, in just your work environment, they are the people that can tell you, hey, this is how you could be useful to us, or, the types of skills you have, what value could it be, in this space or that space. Don't be afraid to just shoot an email, or, go to some kind of professional mixer and say, hey, I'd love to sit down and learn about, your career, your work, how do you see me fitting in with your company? And, these are kind of informational interviews. They're not necessarily having to go somewhere, but the more that you can communicate across disciplines, I think that also adds great value.
Absolutely agree.
Thanks. We're just about out of time here, but I wanted to go to a last couple questions. And the first one kind of goes back to the definitions we talked about early on. Jane, for you, where does the blue economy where does it end? Spatially, if you think about spatially or geographically, where does it end?
Yeah, I see it as all connected. I live in Raleigh, several hundred miles from the coast, but I'm part of the, Neuse River watershed, which then, does dump out into the ocean at a certain point. The things that we do in Raleigh have these effects downstream. Not to say that, pollution or anything good we're doing necessarily, goes that far. There are these kind of, the effects trail off. But I think we all can learn from each other. If we have a model, of resilience. For example, one effort I'm involved in Raleigh is the Upper Neuse River Basin Association. So we manage the Falls Lake watershed, which provides drinking water supply for Raleigh. And we work with all the municipalities in the area, and we actually partner to conserve land. So we put in money from the different municipalities. We then protect and restore that land that is, are in the watershed, to keep our drinking water quality, at a high level for years to come. And so I think we have a model that other places can learn from, and it's important that we're always, kind of touching back, when we get maybe stuck in our own locale.
Greg?
Yeah, and I would say that in some ways it's on, blue economy is almost more of a lens that we look through at the world. So the hydrological cycle is global. Watersheds reach to the highest elevations in any watershed space. So, in terms of the Mississippi, with Deep Blue Institute and Academy, we eventually want to be engaging with an area that I actually spent my formative years in Minnesota and the headwaters of the Mississippi, because what the hog farmers do in Iowa and what the corn farmers do in Missouri and what the wheat farmers do in Minnesota and Wisconsin, all of that matters to the water quality and the second largest algae bloom in the world that occurs every year in the Gulf of Mexico at the mouth of the Mississippi. So all of this is fundamentally interlinked. That's part of when our ecosystem diagram we think of, and this really touches on the education question as well, is with my planner hat and architecture hat, I've really always enjoyed thinking about systems and the interrelationship of systems and systems of systems. So that's what we're getting into when we talk about blue economy and hydrological cycles and watersheds and all that. They're all systems that are interacting, and we need to, it doesn't mean that we can't work and do things in all those areas, but we can engage and need to understand how those systems interact if we're ultimately going to make a change in our coastal areas.
Great, thanks so much. Excuse me. We're just about out of time, so we need to wrap up today, but I'd like to thank Dr. Jane Harrison and Greg DeLon for kicking us off here in a really great discussion. I think we learned a lot about exploring these capitals and the opportunities for development, but making these connections. that concludes our first webinar. The next one, I've posed information in the chat. You can click on those links to follow. And we hope to see you in November at the next Oceans of Opportunities webinar. So thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you all.